A lot of work left to do against poverty and to fight climate change, and we better get back to it. Thank you very much. A lot of work left to do against poverty and to fight climate change, and we better get back to it. Thank you very much.
La consigne, je suis d'accord, tu fais.
There's a lot of work left to do against poverty and to fight climate change, and we better get back to it. Thank you very much.
Dear audience, both in the room and online, we are honored to welcome you to this HEC Talks unprecedented format using the latest hologram technology to bring Professor Duflo from Boston to the famous Jouy-en-Josas. With this technology, we can limit the carbon footprint of our conferences while still bringing in top speakers from around the world. We are proud to be able to offer this experience, and we believe it aligns with our commitment to global impact and sustainability. On 14th of October 2019, you said, "I am very honored. To be honest, I didn't think it was possible to win the Nobel at such a very young age." You claimed this at the occasion of receiving the Nobel Prize in Economic Science for your experimental approach to alleviating global poverty. Today, we are pleased to welcome you, second woman in half a century and the youngest person ever to receive this distinction. As a half French, half American woman, you entered l'École Normale Supérieure before pursuing your vocation in economics at Delta, former Paris School of Economics. To satisfy your intellectual curiosity, but to effect real change in the world at the same time, you were admitted to the MIT for a PhD, and you were then offered tenure in poverty alleviation and development economics. Among other successes, you received the John Blake Clark Medal in 2010 for your critical role in development economics. You are one of the 101st intellectual personas in the world. Your work had earned you a White House selection in 2013 to advise President Barack Obama on development issues. And finally, in 2015, you even received the title of honoris causa professor at what we can call home, HEC Paris. Dear audience, she is a prolific writer and a widely cited scholar who stated back in 2005 to Normal Sup students, "I opened my eyes to a reality that changed my life profoundly. As an economist, I could transform my desire to do something to change the lives of the poorest into an academic career." Thus, she co-founded with her husband and Nobel Prize winner Abhijit Banerjee the MIT's Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab, which we can call Jameel to make it simpler, where she leads research in the economic lives of the world's poorest people and finds ways to alleviate poverty that are grounded in behavioral science. This woman managed to reach the midway between humanitarian action and quantitative career. And yes, dear business school students, it is possible. As a chairholder at the Collège de France on poverty and public policy, and one of the most celebrated economists in the world, a British newspaper stated, "Step aside, Sartre, this is the new face of French intellectualism." She shows hints of idealism, has faith in redistribution, and she subscribes to the optimistic notion that tomorrow might turn out better than today. Following on from these prospects, what fills her head is the thought of doing good science. And nowadays, good science especially applies to climate change as the great inequalizer. Why, would you say? We sure are all affected by the issue, but not equally. She stands by the fact that the world's poorest people and nations bear the brunt of its impact, widening existing disparities and creating new ones between and within countries. Should economists be more concerned about how to actually make public policy work? She thinks so. In tonight's talks, she will discuss the connection between inequality and climate change and whether there are or not economic tools and solutions to address both poverty and climate mitigation, adaptation, and resilience all at once. Is it possible to consider the building of equity and inclusion into climate action for a sustainable future? This evening, most of your underlying questions on the matter will certainly be answered. Additional questions will be taken at the end of the conference, and we encourage those watching online to post the question in the chat, as the interaction will be just as powerful as if we were all gathered in one single room. Please join me in welcoming Professor Esther Duflo, and thank you very much for joining us tonight again.
Bonsoir à toutes, bonsoir à tous. Hello, I'm glad to be here. I'm, in some sense, glad to be here in this format as well, since I'm going to be talking about climate change, and it seems fitting that I didn't take a plane to come join you. I have described climate change as the political problem from hell, and let me explain to you why it's so. It's so because, unfortunately, the people who are the most responsible for climate change are not the people who are the most affected by climate change. Let me start by the responsibilities. Of course, we know that historically, the bulk of the emissions that are responsible for the warming of the planet today have taken place in the countries that are today rich, in the service of the industrial revolution that has made, that has fueled our system of development. So this is something that everybody acknowledges. That's fine. But often you hear that, and then you hear, but now, of course, it has changed because a lot of the emissions actually come from China and quite a bit from India. And the trend, in fact, for China and India compared to, say, the US and Europe are not favorable, with India and China starting to produce more emissions. So in negotiations, there is always this kind of uncomfortable positions of the countries saying, well, historically we might be responsible for it, but now this is really much more shared and everybody needs to make an effort, and we shouldn't all be blamed. In fact, we are making more of an effort, so it's kind of your turn to make an effort, which puts, in particular, India on a very defensive position. Now, what this is forgetting is that even today, the bulk of the emissions that are responsible for climate change are due to rich people. And of course, rich people are mostly in rich countries. And you can see that if you change a little bit the way that you calculate emissions. So typically, we attribute emission to the place where they are in fact emitted. So if you drive your car, that's the emission of the car. But then we should also think about what has happened to build this car and the emissions that were created when this car was built, presumably not in the country where it's driven, maybe in China or maybe in Mexico. And if we want to be really fair in allocating the responsibility of the climate change emissions to people in the world, then we should really try and go back to the consumption and the carbon content of our consumption. Now, of course, that's not immediately available in the data. That needs to be estimated. Lucas Chancel has done a lot of work to try and estimate that by combining the elasticity of carbon emission of consumption with respect to income with income inequality data at the world level to basically estimate for each person a full carbon equivalent footprint based on their place in the income distribution of their countries and in the world. And when we do that, we can now calculate by your position in the income distribution of the world, how much do you contribute to the problem of climate change. And it's pretty easy to remember the results because there is a simple mnemonic rule, which is the 50-10 rule. Roughly speaking, 10% of the highest polluter at the citizen level, so 10% of the people in the world are, the richest people in the world are responsible for 50% of the global emission. And the 50% poor fraction of the world is only responsible for 10% of the global emission. There was no reason why these things would land exactly symmetrically, but they do. So the 10% richest people contribute 50% of the global emission, and the 50% poorer people contribute 10% of the global emission. And of course, if you look where these people are located, the richest people tend to be in richer countries, and the poorer people tend to be in poorer countries. So even at the country level, you still get that the bulk of the emission, the real emission, the real carbon footprint, still takes place in the richer countries today. And even in poor countries, it's mainly the richer citizens of the poor countries that are responsible for the emissions. That's the first half of the problem. The second half of the problem is that the cost of climate change is also unequally distributed, but in the other direction. Of course, this is not something that often we think we should insist on, because it's very good for people in France to realize that when there is a very hot summer, there are problems in France. It's very good for people in the US to realize that the forest fire in California affects them as well. But the true reality, the fact of the matter is that first order, climate change is hurting the poor, and in particular hurting the poorest citizens in the world. Why is that the case? The first reason is purely mechanical, and it turns out that poor people tend to live in places that are already hot. So, for example, you look at the Sahel region of Africa, the northern part of Latin America, and you're seeing that those places are already hot, and therefore, even if the planet is warming at an equal rate in every country, those places that are already hot are going to experience more very hot days by 2050, by 2100. And the cost of temperature on human health and on the ability to produce food and so on is not linear. And in particular, there is something quite dramatic that happens after 32 degrees centigrade, where it becomes really unlivable, especially with humidity on top of that. And the fact is, those countries that are poor, particularly the Sahel region of Africa, the north of Latin America, the whole South Asian continent, are going to experience more and more and more of those very, very hot days. The second problem is that the ability to protect yourself against this very high temperature is directly related to how much income the country is making. So, for example, it's going to become about equally hot and unbearably hot in Pakistan and in Saudi Arabia. But in Saudi Arabia, there is a lot of money. They can buy all of the air conditioning they want, and with that, they can protect themselves against this very hot temperature. After all, we had a World Cup in Qatar where we air conditioned entire football fields. In Pakistan, they don't have this option. So even though these two regions will experience more or less the same warming over the next 50 or 100 years, the impact, the estimated impact in terms of mortality will be much higher in Pakistan than it is in Saudi Arabia. Similarly, you can compare Texas, where a lot of people work inside, people have the ability to use air conditioning, to places in India, where if it's become very hot, agriculture is going to fail. The water table is falling down, and people who work outside don't have the ability to protect themselves against this very hot temperature. So the consequence is that if you're looking at the mortality impact of climate change, the impact overall is going to be an increase by 2000 using a high emission scenario. The impact is going to be about an extra 73 deaths per 10,000 people, which corresponds roughly to all the deaths from HIV, malaria, tuberculosis combined. So all of the deaths from infectious diseases combined. It's going to be one of the biggest killers of people, below cancer and heart attacks. All of these deaths are going to be in poor countries. In fact, on average, in rich country, global warming is actually going to be good for mortality because global warming means milder winters, and people are not going to die during cold spells in the winter. So the impact of climate change are dramatically unequal on this very basic foundation of life, which is, are you dying from the hot temperature? When you look at other effects of climate change, for example, the flooding of cities that are on the borders, you get the same things. First of all, there are more poor countries that are low-lying and at threat of being flooded. So that's Bangladesh, for example. Second of all, there are more, the richer countries have more ability to protect themselves. So you compare, for example, Holland to Indonesia, and their ability to protect themselves against rising levels of water is very different. So on the one hand, we have a problem which is caused mainly in rich countries. And on the other hand, we have a problem that affects mainly poor countries. So we really find ourselves into a very unique situation where countries which had made a ton of progress in the last 30 years or so in dealing with poverty, with infant mortality, with maternal mortality, with getting kids into schools and so on, will find themselves in a situation where there's going to be a great reversal in a lot of these gains unless we do something. But it's not, or unless the climate change is stopped, but it's not in their power to do so because they don't control the emission. So the question that is before us is, are we as a world able to take leadership? And in particular, are we as a world and as a rich part of the world able to take our responsibility for limiting the problem and also for compensating the poor countries? So there, unfortunately, the experience of COVID is not very encouraging. There was basically two things we could have done very early on to limit the problem of COVID and to compensate the poor countries for the impact it had on their economy. One was to ensure very rapid vaccination of everyone. This didn't happen. And the other was to provide massive financial transfers to the poor countries to help them protect their population in the same way that we were protecting our own population. So during the COVID crisis, the rich countries spent about 24% of their portfolio on fiscal measures to protect their citizens. The poor countries spent about 2% of their GDP to protect their citizens. Because, of course, they didn't have the ability that the rich countries have to borrow. And nobody came to their rescue, even to bring them to the same level of 24%, which would have been so much less money because their GDPs are so much smaller. So this kind of suggests to me that we cannot wait until the crisis is upon us, even more than now, until the disaster strikes repeatedly in those countries to think that it's time to do something. We need to act now. And we need to act now in those two fronts. First of all, an effort to severely limit emissions in the rich countries. Second of all, a real financial effort to protect the poor countries and to help them mitigate, adapt, and cope with the disasters that are already going to happen no matter what we do in the next few years. At the last COP, there was the creation of a loss and damage fund, which is a good first step. Unfortunately, like most of the similar efforts that have been existing in previous COPs, it lacked the financial mechanism to put any money into this fund. So I think the next thing to really put on the political agenda, and this is where I would like to, encourage you to put your political force, your lobbying force, your energy, is into getting a real international financing of this fund. One mechanism, something that has been proposed, for example, by Thomas Piketty, is to have international taxation of the very, very rich. Whether or not this is possible, I don't know. Something that does seem possible, because we've already done the first step, is an international taxation of corporations. There was already an international agreement to have corporation be taxed at no less than 15% in all the countries. But in this agreement, all the countries kept the money for themselves who were leveraging the tax. I think it seems to me that it would be possible, and I've made similar points in front of the board of the IMF that didn't seem that it was crazy, to think of an international system of taxation of corporation that would fund a fund, like a loss and damage fund, for the developing countries. I would like to see this fund to be larger than loss and damage, in the sense that it should be a fund to be spent exclusively in developing countries, but to be devoted not just to coping with problems, but also ideating the innovative solution of tomorrow to fight climate change, which can happen in the poor countries as well, particularly since they don't have in place the outdated infrastructure that's there in the rich countries. They can leapfrog the bad infrastructure to go straight to the good infrastructure if they have the money to do so. They should do that with the financing of the whole world, because by doing that, they're doing a favor to the whole world. Other thing one could consider doing with money in this fund is to protect the forests, protect large swaths of forest that exist today that don't need to be cut down. This is possible if farmers who own this forest are compensated to do it, if governments are trying to regulate farms so that they don't clear cut, have the enforcement capacity to do it, and don't have the temptation of, say, replacing grain forest with palm oil. So all of that is possible, and to some extent a matter of money. Another thing that is to some extent a matter of money is to develop coping solutions that do not make the problem worse at the same time as they solve it in the short run. One key example of that is air conditioning. Air conditioning is essential to protect people when it's so hot outside, but at the same time, in particular, the older generation air conditioning emits a ton of fluor in the atmosphere, which are terrible for global warming. When there have been agreements to phase out those terrible air conditioning machines, China and India managed to obtain a permission to postpone these adjustments till 2024. And this is really ridiculous, because this means that until 2024, these bad machines are going to be sold, and they are going to stay in people's homes for years, contributing to the problem. It is clearly a matter of money that was not available, or that the rich countries were not willing to spend to help finance this effort. To conclude, I think another thing that such a fund would do is compensate the terrible ignorance that we have in this framework. The climate sector is unfortunately dominated by a lot of magical thinking, the idea that some technological solution can get us out of the global warming problem without us changing any of our behavior. I think it's very unlikely that it's fully true, but I think there is a lot of things that we need to try. We need to try how to change people's behavior. We need to try which technology are really effective in the field and which are just effective in the laboratory, which is less useful. We need to help each country develop their own innovative solution that works in their countries, to protect their citizens, to help them adapt to a new reality, and to mitigate the problem in the future. My lab, the JPAL, has been working on this issue. We have an initiative called the King Center for Climate Action. I really invite each and every one of you of starting to work on this issue at whatever is your level. There is political action that is needed. There is new science that needs to be developed. There is new technology that needs to be rolled out. There's new experiments that need to be run. This is a problem that is going to define our generation, not just for the distant future, but frankly, as far as the life of the very poor in the world is living for the next 10 or 20 years. So we need to get going, and I count on your energy to be part of this.
Thank you, Esther Duflo, for being here with us tonight and for this enlightening expose. We're very honored to have you here tonight. As you explained, poverty and the ability to fight against climate change are really intertwined. And you suggest in your book, Good Economics for Hard Times, that we create a Green New Deal, basically, which means that we implement measures that tackle global climate change as well as global inequalities. And you just said that we could achieve that by funding poorer countries, especially by taxing corporations, for instance. Could you give us an example or multiple examples of concrete measures that could be adopted in poorer countries to fight quickly poverty and climate change?
Yes, so I'll give you a couple of examples. So there is one a study by Seema Jayachandra which looks at payment for ecosystem services. So this is basically this is a class of projects that exists, but she has evaluated one in Uganda. And the idea is if people have trees on their plots of land, they would normally clear them in order to start growing fields. Growing things. So for them, they need to grow maize or to eat it, or cassava to eat it, or cocoa to sell it. But of course, for the world, that's not such a good thing because it's nice to have big trees there. They are good for absorbing the CO2. And so what she tested is a program where people were enrolled into the PS if they wanted to, in a randomized fashion in some villages and not some others. And what she found is, number one, people were a little bit reluctant to enroll in the system, so she didn't have a huge enthusiasm to enroll in the system. And number two, that despite that, the countries that had, the villages where the system was in place, experienced a much lower deforestation than the other countries. And this was not, the other villages, sorry, and this was not compensated by people starting clearing public forest or something like that. So this suggests, number one, that this system, this type of payment for eco protection services, if they are well implemented, can really make a difference. And secondly, that there is also progress that we could implement them even better than the way it's done today. So that's one example. Another example is this. Actually, another idea of, so of course this reduces poverty because people are paid directly, and this protects the planet at the same time. Another example is which reduces poverty and contribute to the adaptation to climate change, maybe not to the mitigation, but it's also very important, is a project in Niger, in the Sahel region, that looks at how to put back in cultivation areas that are severely degraded. So one of the reasons why you keep needing to cut forests is that some areas that have been cut a long time ago are now kind of unusable because they have turned into semi-desert. So this is work by Jenny Acker and Kelsey Jack. They look at something called demi-lune. These are basically half-moon shape holes that you can put in semi-desertic areas in order to very effectively collect the water. This costs almost no money, but it costs some effort. This is like big hole, and people also need to understand how to do it. And they work with farmers to teach them how to do it, and they found that people, once they know, are extraordinarily willing to adopt these technologies, which is not always the case with agricultural technology. Small improvements are generally, people are not so interested. But this ability to produce food where it was not before possible turns out to be super popular. So in this case, it's just a matter of training farmers, training trainers that can train more farmers, and so on. So that's another thing that you directly address poverty, because these are people who live in extreme poverty, at the same time as you deal with climate change adaptation.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think we can see here that to tackle the climate change crisis, we need to change our behaviors, and it's not always easy. And I also heard you in many talks saying that you were actually optimistic that we can change behavior, especially in rich countries where we know we pollute the most. And maybe also this question is raised in poor countries where we need to find good ways to push people to adopt certain behavior to align with those objectives. But still, I feel like the examples of this change are scarce. I mean, many of us, despite being educated, we still struggle to adapt a simple, sustainable behavior. Would you say that examples of changing behaviors are scarce because there is a lack of research and implementation of the proper economic and social incentives?
So first of all, let's kind of question this premise of whether the example of change are scarce. Because if you compare the US to Europe, you know, the European Union is about as rich as the US. The emission of citizens in Europe are so much lower than they are in the US. So it really shows, and I don't think people are so much miserable as a result. So it shows that conditioning for the amount of disposable income that exists in countries, you can actually behave quite differently. First order. So there is a big it shows that there are big first order possibilities. Now, of course, the US is a much bigger country. It's getting to go from one place to another, you have to take planes or trains, but that's not just it. So at each level of consumption, the very rich in the US emit so much more than the very rich in Europe, and the middle class in the US emit so much more than the rich in Europe, and so on. So that shows that actually it's like possible to go on different paths, even in the relatively recent past that this divergence has taken place. What is scarcer is from the state where we are, either in the US or in Europe, significant change is going down. On balance, we probably have peaked, which is a good thing. But the slowing down is much slower than it should be. And I think the reason for that is partly because there is a reluctance to even try, because there is a sense that, people are going to be resistant, they are not going to want to do that. And in fact, when there was an attempt to have a carbon tax, there was a yellow jacket movement. So after that, the government got very, very scared and didn't want to move anywhere in this direction. And I think that's an error. That's a mistake. I think people would be willing to change their behavior, but you have to approach it in the right way. The idea that you would put a carbon tax, which would essentially mean higher gasoline prices, or force people to retire the older car, is seen by the poor people in our country, for example, as a direct attack on them. It's asking them to bear the brunt of the incidence of climate change. And that just never works. Similarly, in India, where farmers have free electricity, which is terrible because it leads to overuse of electricity and overuse of water, which is bad for them in the pretty short term. It's not going to be good for them. Any attempt to increase the cost of electricity is really widely resisted because it is seen as being directly against them. So there, I think, and it is seen, and in a sense, it is, until we have a very convincing and very well formulated plan to compensate the poor people for any behavior change we demand from them. So, for example, if you want people to not drive their old car, they need to be a really effective transportation system. You cannot at the same time, or you can, but it doesn't work very well, at the same time reduce the number of metro and RER that comes into Paris and make it essentially unworkable for people to commute by public transport, and in the same at the same time make it more expensive and more difficult to drive your car. This is what creates the tension and crispations. And there are a few examples of doing the two at the same time. For example, Indonesia got rid of diesel subsidy, and all of that money was put into a direct cash transfer to the poor. And that worked well.
So is it really about finding the good plan of action, the good way to implement a policy that will push people to change and they will be eager to do it? And so how do we implement, how do we create that plan? Do we need randomized controlled trials to do it?
We do need a lot of randomized controlled trials to do it because we have no idea exactly, well, we have very little idea of what will be effective. I'll give you an example. The one plan that exists today in France is weatherization of houses, improving the insulation and so on.
Yes.
There has been several randomized evaluation of this type of programs in the US, in Mexico. They don't work. At least they've never worked. Maybe they'll work in France, but we don't know because there is no evaluation of it as far as I can tell. So a lot of money is put into something that's not the most effective way, not out of, out of ignorance in a sense. So we need to kind of quickly fill up this ignorance. There are some things we already know that are small things we can do but are already effective. So, like, for example, playing on the social network, showing people how much they consume relative to other people. We also know that people are creatures of habit, so once they start something, it sticks. So, for example, people started driving their bicycles in Paris during the strikes, and they are still driving their bicycles. So large investments have a long-term impact on behavior. So there is a few things we know, but there is a lot we don't know on to what are effective levers of behavior.
Yes, and about
Partly
that.
because sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. So yeah, because for the things we don't know, so you suggest we might need a randomized controlled trial, and I will ask you something. I'm sure you're used to it, but randomized controlled trials, designing good incentive is costly, and it's also a tedious work. So would you say that it's actually the right way to tackle a crisis that requires urgent action?
Compared to spending a ton of money on things that are ineffective, for sure.
Yeah, but
I mean, the amount of money that has been, the amount of time, compare what we know in terms of how to fight climate change to what we know in terms of how to fight poverty. In the last 20 years, there have been so much progress on the fight against poverty. We are so much more cost effective. And in climate, nothing. And there is tons of ESG funding that is going to things that have, as far as we know, are not particularly impactful. And that's a huge waste of money. So to me, we cannot continue with this state of ignorance. We have to, of course, we have to do what we can as fast as we can. But in the meantime, we also have to build the evidence base. The climate world is so behind in terms of what to do to change behavior that it is high time we catch up.
So it's another call for action for the GPAL.
And many other people. It is
for sure.
There are a lot of other people who are doing this type of work.
So you talk about changing behavior, and you also say, on the other hand, that we should not entirely rely on technology, and that relying and believing that technology will save us from climate change could actually be dangerous because maybe it will not happen. But you also warn us that the poorest countries need energy-intensive technologies, such as you said, air conditioning, for instance, to prevent the economic and human costs of the rising of extreme temperatures. So in their effort to repair the damages done to poor countries, should rich countries invest heavily in low-carbon adaptation technologies to prevent the trade-off between mitigation and adaptation?
Well, what's happening in the poor countries in terms of the consumption of the poor citizen is really a drop in the bucket. So, yes, I mean, that's what I was saying when I was talking earlier. We might as well do it in the, we might as well do the investment, say, in electric grid to make sure that it's not based on charcoal and so on, in order to leapfrog the costly technology. But the reality is that, Africa contributes nothing to climate change. So if they were to increase a little bit their CO2 emission, that would have pretty much no impact compared to anything that, any behavior change that takes place in the richer countries. India is in an interesting middle position because it's a big country, it's become a middle income country, and the technologies are very inefficient. So it's responsible for a lot of climate change directly. It has also a lot of very rich people who are contributing to the problems themselves. That said, yes, and some of these technologies already exist. For example, there are clean air conditioning machines. And it's unfortunate that it's really a matter of money, that when there was the agreement on air conditioning in Kigali several years ago, the phasing out of the bad air conditioning machine, the energy-intensive, fluor-intensive machines was so slow, in particular in India and China. And so this is an example of an investment where we already knew about 10 years ago what needed to be done, and yet we didn't do it. So it's an example of an investment that could take place. Another example is helping countries build hydroelectric dams or solar power plants. Today, this is all done in the form of loans, and that's why they are not particularly excited to get into that, because they are seeing about the impact on their finances down the line, and will go for the cheaper option if it means less money.
So are you saying, basically, would you say that developing countries would be better off if rich countries would stop investing in like miracle technology and clean technology, and would give all their money that they're nowadays investing in research for cleaner technologies to them, to help them fight the consequences of climate change?
Well, I don't think you need all the money. So, I do think you need to raise more money anyways. As I said, I think having a tax on corporations, and in particular, and if possible, a tax on very, very rich people, would have the advantage that it would raise money that can be given to poor countries for all of these goals, and in addition, would have, would have an incentive effect on the behavior of these corporations, particularly if the taxes was related to carbon footprint or carbon mitigation behavior of the firms, which is possible if we had good accounting of the carbon impact of the firms, which is maybe not the case, but could be the case. So I think new money needs to be raised, and that would take care of a lot of things. Whether or not the country, whether the rich countries, no, I think the research can continue. We should just not. I'll say something stronger. I think the research should continue into developing better technologies. The cost of solar, the cost of wind has gone down so dramatically in the last few years that it is really impactful. Even though this is not enough to compensate the growth, so we still emit more than we used to. But it would be even worse if we didn't have the big decrease in the cost of solar and wind. So by all means, all this technological investment needs to continue, but we should not hope that it's going to solve the entire problem. We really need to change, not just how we fuel what we consume, but also how we consume. And the problem with a lot of the political discourse in the West, particularly in the US, is that they are much more focused on the former, which is you don't have to change anything to your life, we just have to electrify it. And I think that might be a little over optimistic.
Okay, thank you. So we were talking about technologies, and I wanted to ask you, since we are at HEC in a business school, maybe the role of the private sector. We see that there is something to do with technologies, but my question is, because the private sector is driven by profitability, would you say that it is doomed to contribute only thanks to solutions that are win-wins, for instance, energy efficient technologies? Or maybe we can have awards on so-called impact entrepreneurships, that is that ambitions to integrate social and environmental objectives in corporate purpose. So what do you think about that?
So I think that ESG has become very big business, and the result of it become very big business is that it's become a business. There are now any number of reports showing, everything ranging from greenwashing to pure manipulation of accounting manipulation of ESG. And I think the problem we have in the ESG sector is that what has been accepted as a standard of evidence for what constitutes an improvement is just very murky. It's not at all clear what is impact, how we define, how we say that we have had an impact. And in the business world, because we are used to look at profits, which is pretty simple. The profits, we know how to, it's not so simple, but it's relatively simple. We know how to account for profits. I think there has been a bit too much of a hope that measure impact would be similarly easy and you could do it. And I know, for example, that I have never been able to make any progress and to have any reasonable conversation with impact investment about what is impact, and are you really sure that what you are doing or what you are financing under the impact investment wings actually generates impact. And I think this is the core problem with that entire sector. And until it's addressed, this is going to be underperforming, even if there are people who are relatively or very well-meaning in going into this sector. Given that, clearly the corporate sector has a role to play in, I think, more cleaning its own ways of doing things, rather than trying to figure out other things to invest in that are clean or something. So the big corporations have to do their own work in a way that is better for society and better for the climate. And I think they will do that if they are forced by the proper regulatory framework. Otherwise, the pressure to generate profits and to have your action, the stock market prices go up is too strong. That's not human to go against that. So I think it's quite essential that, again, this puts the politics at the center of it. It's quite essential that we have, as societies, the willingness to create and impose on corporations the framework under which they can run their business the best, the way that they want to. And so that the firms would not have to reinvent it. Which is why, again, I think taxation of firms for the purpose of compensating the poorer countries is the way to go. Which is also why I think that if this taxation is related to a proper accounting of the carbon impact of the firm, that's going to further help. And then the firms don't have to invent anything. They can just work within the framework of the law.
Okay, so regulation is needed, and I know you work on the shortcomings of regulation in India. I think it might be interesting to understand how we can make sure that regulation is effective if it's actually a good tool to tackle the climate crisis.
Well, regulation, once it's there, needs to be enforced. And what ensures that regulation is enforced? It's to have strong institutions and to have trust in governments. So that relates to the next point, which is absolutely critical to make the fight against climate change possible, is to have decent trust in government. And all over the world, trust in government is falling and falling and falling and falling. And that's, I think, a huge crisis, both in rich countries and in poorer countries. So if you don't have trust in governments, when something is proposed, which would be, like, for example, a new tax to finance, to compensate the victim of climate change, there is going to be immediate mistrust that that money is going to be misused and not spent to the right place and so on. When there is mistrust in government, there is going to be the presumption that even if a rule is there on the books, it is not really, it's for sure, it's not there in reality, and therefore you can flaunt it. So it's really important and that we kind of work together on rebuilding the trust in government. Again, what does it, there's no magic bullet to do that, but political involvement, participating in election, calling your representative, being a candidate, having projects, all of that plays a part in that. In my profession, I think my profession has a role to, some blame to take for this mistrust in government, because there is nothing economists like better than government bashing. And I think that's both often unfair, because that's forgetting a government deal with very difficult problems, like trying to convince firms to do things they don't want to do, or people to do things they don't want to do. And really dangerous, because this has contributed to this general difficulty in getting anything done for government, including enforcing their own regulations.
Thank you. Thank you very much for answering our questions. We're going to now ask the audience, the online audience and the real live audience in front of us, to ask questions. So if anybody of you have questions, you can raise your hands.
Thank you very much, Ms. Duflo, for intervening tonight. How do we do with corruption? Because we can raise maybe a lot of money, but public money needs to be spent according to very precise criterion. And if we bypass the states we give this money to, they won't become credible. But if we give them directly to them, maybe it will be inefficient because of corruption. So how do we distribute this aid? Thank you.
That's a good point, but again, this is something that we tend to overdo, I think. And I think the emphasis on corruption and on the risk of corruption is part of the reason why there is this huge deficit in trust of governments. There is corruption, there is inefficiency, but in part it's because governments do very difficult things. And there is also corruption in rich countries, plenty of it, and there is also corruption among firms. And in fact, for example, an example of both is the admission scandals that took place in the US in top schools some years ago was exactly that. Was universities trying to allocate seats not to the person who can pay the most, but to the person who needed the most, and then the person who could pay more trying to find the backdoor entries anyway. So it shows you the very, very strong pressure towards corruption in any settings. So how do we deal with it? So the best is to deal with it by trying to develop processes that are as corruption-free as possible, so treat corruption as another problem to be solved. So in fact, in my research, I've done a lot of research on corruption and on trying to alleviate corruption. So for example, we were just talking of the enforcement of environmental regulation in India. There was a system to regulate the most polluting firm. That system had a third-party auditing system, which is rife with conflict of interest and led to a lot of corruption of the private firms, actually, not of the government in this instance. And we were able to come up with a system that's much more robust and not subject to this conflict of interest. We experimented with it. It was very effective, and then it got scaled up to the entire state of Gujarat. Another example is today, one way in which you could easily compensate people is through cash transfer going directly to people. The technology exists in many countries through, for example, electronic wallets that people have on their cell phones. You could imagine a system that would have a very mild footprint of the states, where when a zone is declared to be a victim of a disaster, climate-related disaster, a flood or a drought, people would immediately be compensated. So there would be no time for, this would be this would be mechanical. There would be no place for judgment. Satellite images can be used to determine that a place needs to be put in the system at this point. People would be already registered in the system, get the money really, really fast. So there would be credibility that, oh, this thing is actually working for us, and the system would be quite immune to corruption. So that's an example of something you could do. And then, of course, any other things that governments would do, they would have to use their usual monitoring system. If there was a fund, the fund itself would have its own mechanism for controlling corruption to avoid these issues.
Dr. Duflo, here at HEC Juillan-Josas, we've been monitoring the dozens of questions raining in from viewers following you on LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube, writing from all over the world. And I'd like to submit a few of them. First of all, Martina, who's a visiting student from India, and she's here in Paris. She asks if it's fair to compare the pollution emitted without considering the size of the population. Let's say we compare India and Luxembourg.
No, not particularly. That's why it makes sense that's another reason why it makes sense to go back to the individual level and to look at, to try to basically estimate for each person in the world, no matter where they are, what is their carbon footprint. Then you're going to ask not what's the carbon footprint of India versus Luxembourg, but what's the carbon footprint of of a person who happens to be in the 10% of the richest people in India, for example, compared to the 10% richest people in the Luxembourg. So if you do that by person, then you don't have this population weighting skewness.
Then there's a question that touches on the 1% at the very top. Pauline in Marseille is asking if we can persuade rich people to act individually and collectively towards fighting poverty and climate change, whilst Alexandre in Quebec wonders if you have mechanisms to persuade the richest to turn away from their desire to fly into outer space and focus on solving the problems on Earth.
No, I don't. That's why I don't want to rely on it. I don't think we should rely on any individual goodwill. First of all, we know historically that very few of people who have the most amounts of money decide to use significant amounts of it to do real good in the world. And we also know that their consumption patterns are bad for the environment. So I don't think we should wait for them to willingly surrender their riches. I think that's a little bit hopeless. So that's why it would be much simpler if we could tax them. I continue to think that taxing individual at the worldwide level is hard, not necessarily impossible, but probably difficult. But if one could do that, that would definitely be the way to go.
Let's turn to the fact that temperature trends across the entire globe aren't uniform because of the diverse geography on our planet. And so Marcus in Vienna is wondering that given that the heating up is not equal everywhere, does it not make it more complicated to fight climate change?
I think it's a little second order relative to the fact that again, the consequences of the warming are much less for the richer countries. I think this is what makes it difficult, because we really need the action to take place mostly in the richer countries, because this is where most of the emissions are, either directly or in the form of goods that we buy from poorer countries that export them to us. But the cost is not felt in those countries. So I think that's first order. The fact that the warming itself is uneven is dominated by that. And in terms of the impact on reaching the danger zone of temperature, that is also dominated by the fact that of how hot is already today, as opposed to how much the warming will be in different places.
I've read that you've called on, I believe, slower growth, but Timo in Paris is wondering what your view is on degrowth to address climate change and its impact on poverty.
I think we just should stop worrying too much about growth one way or the other. We used to be obsessed by growth as the measure of success, and a lot of evil was done in the name of economic growth, including, for example, tolerating a huge increase in inequality in the US, in the UK, even in Europe, a little less so, in the name of growth. And in poor countries, similar temptations exist, that you need to create the conditions for the rich to become richer, so that they have the incentive to create the technologies that are going to bring growth. All of that has been pretty damaging, without necessarily creating much growth. Similarly, calling for degrowth seems to be similarly unproductive, in the sense that it's not that we control growth. No one knows how growth happens or doesn't happen, or degrowth happens. We also don't know how to do that. So we should just think directly about what are the objectives. And the objective should be, in my opinion, the welfare of the poorest people in the world. And we should do things that lead to that, both in the short run and in the longer run, in particular by avoiding making the planet inhabitable where they live. So in some countries, you might this might lead to the richer people growing their income less fast, but the poorer people growing their income faster. In some countries that are very, very poor, it might lead everybody growing, ideally. But as long as we keep our eyes on what's the objective, which is welfare, how long people live, whether they live good lives, whether they feel empowered to live their life the way they want, then those are the right questions to ask, as opposed to going always back to this very aggregate, somewhat abstract concept of growth, degrowth, etc., that we do not control anyways, that are not really policy instruments.
Yes, hello, Mrs. Duflo is here.
Hi.
Hi. So first of all, it's a great honor to talk to you, because your book, Économie utile pour les temps difficiles, really inspired me at a time where I was about to give up on my studies, so thank you. And my question is, sometimes when we compare ourselves, Europeans, to, on the one side, America, and on the other one, China, it feels as though we have most of the good ideas, but none of the influence. So is there any leverage that Europe has to be the leading contributor to a slightly less warm, slightly more equal tomorrow?
First of all, thank you for sharing this story about your life. I feel very heartened. If our book did that, that's already one thing it did. So that's very nice to share. Second of all, I think we need to be a little less proud of our achievement in Europe. Yeah, true enough, on average, we emit less than people do in the US, but the rich people in Europe emit as much as the middle class in the US. So there is also work we can do in Europe, and we should do it. And it's already, the European emissions are not negligible in the worldwide emission. So there is plenty of work we can do for ourselves that will require a change in behavior. And then there is the hope that this will also inspire others to do similar things. In particular, countries that have not yet completely set their growth path and the way they want to set up their investment and their infrastructure investment. So that's China, that's India, etc. Which now find it easy to say, who are you to tell us to develop differently? You're still responsible for most of the problem.
Thank you, Professor, for your time tonight. So I wanted to weigh in on or ask about the behavioral change versus technology solution debate, and taking your own two statements. First, the one with the gilet jaune, where you said French people are only willing to abandon their car if RER is offered, which is a technological solution. And then second, you're saying we shouldn't rely on the goodwill of people. Isn't every behavioral change technology-based, as people only opt for another option if it increases their level of welfare? So isn't every behavioral change needs to be provided by a base technologically solution?
If you define technology in a very, very broad sense, then that becomes true by definition. But if you're talking about the RER now, it's not a matter of technologies. Technology is there. The RER are already there. The problem with the RER is that there are not enough people who actually run them. They are not reliable enough. The investment in the tracks has not been done. So it's not a matter of inventing a new way to do things. It's a matter of putting the human and financial resources behind having a system that is effectively working. So in that sense, I don't think that's, you're right. If the RER technology didn't exist, we should invent it. That's a pretty good one. But it's, at this point, it's really a matter of policy, politics, humans, organization, industrial organization maybe, and not technologies. A lot of the behavior change are about, will probably be about consuming less and consuming differently. So, for example, there was all this discussion this summer about people taking plane for short distance. There is people have probably the ability to purchase fewer things. They probably purchase more things than they need or use, and all of that is more about behavior than about technologies. Sometimes the technology can help support a change in behavior. For example, this idea that people consume less energy when you send them a letter to tell them how much they consume relative to their neighbors. First of all, you need a letter, so that's a form of technology. Second of all, the way they do that is by putting their thermostat lower, and that's a technology. So they are, to say that the two are completely distinct is neither here nor there. And I didn't say you couldn't trust people to do the right thing. I said you can trust rich people to do the right thing.
Can I ask a follow-up question on that?
I'm not moderating.
Okay, if you take the time, I'd like to take the opportunity. I want to ask if there is any empirical proof that people are actually willing to consume less. Right now, after COVID, we've seen that within 2.5 years, flights are back to the pre-COVID levels, although the world's getting better educated, knows more about climate change and the impact of air travel on climate change. So isn't this another field where we definitely need a technological solution? We can't rely on people consuming less?
I think there are plenty of examples that people's consumption is not that people don't have very strong preferences and don't have very strong expectation of what their life should be, and that there is not necessarily and in the idea that is very fundamental to economics that more is always better is not necessarily the way that people behave. So we have a lot of this discussion in poor economics in chapter 4, which is called likes, wants, and needs, which tries to show precisely that how you decide to, there's plenty of evidence from sociology, from psychology, and from economics that the way that you decide what's an acceptable level and mode of consumption is, first of all, extraordinarily socially determined. So it's like, it depends on what people are doing around you. And second of all, is also very habit forming. So we kind of tend to continue to do what we have always done. So that's why you can have now a very, very different consumption profile in Europe and in the US, and yet the Europeans are being not particularly unhappy after compared to the Americans, we think, from the way it's measured. So in terms of examples, so for example, getting a letter for how much electricity you consume, that affects people's consumption of electricity. And then that effect persists after you stop sending people letters. So that shows both that people are willing to consume less, and that they are, and that these changes are persistent over time. So now part of this is because they use better the technology that's at their disposal. Part of it is also because they choose, say, to have their house a little bit cooler in the winter and warmer in the summer, and they wear sweaters and so on. So you can call that technology, but it's mainly about behavior. So whether you ask me whether it's enough, no, it's not enough, but there are examples of durable changes. I was pretty convinced that the COVID changes would not last because they were under so extraordinary circumstances that people were just too eager to go back to some notion of pre. It's different when, in a sense, the changes are ushered by kind of a social move, a regulation move, a political move towards a particular equilibrium.
Thank you. I think we have time for two more last questions from the audience.
Hi, Mrs. Duflo, and thank you so much for this brilliant talk. So you've been mentioned there's currently a funding gap to tackling the inequality between developed and developing economies, and there's a funding gap in bringing real impactful changes. And maybe it's not the time to start taxing everyone. However, there are some global measures, I think, in this field that are trying to tackle the funding gap. For example, the offset market, SBTI, or natural capital, sustainable linked bonds. I'm thinking among these measures, do you find that maybe some of them have the potential to actually delivering the real impact? Or if not, what do you think needs to be put in place? And thank you.
Well, I think that really remains to be seen, and I'm a little doubtful because a lot of these measures basically are put in place to try and say, kind of demonstrate that we are doing something. And then when you try and trace what is being done with that money, it's a little bit disappointing, perhaps, in large part because the climate change world is driven by this techno-optimism we discussed, and by a lack of willingness to confront possible solutions, financial or technological, to the field. So there was a very interesting article in The Guardian several weeks ago that looked at the projects that are funded by Vera, which is an intermediary that supports a lot of the payment for ecosystem services. That I gave you an example that was successful, but there are many, many, many examples that are less so. And what this study concluded is that the Vera project contributed exactly zero to protecting the forests. And it's, I think, not an accident. I think it's a structure of it's a consequence of the way that this funding is structured, where basically the reward are given by pretending to have an impact, regardless whether you have one or not. And nobody is there to really represent the interest of the planet or the interest of poor people. So I think these systems are pretty flawed for that reason. And I think the last few COPs have really been characterized by, first of all, not following up on commitment that were done vis-à-vis the poor. So the 100 billion a year commitment that was made in Copenhagen years ago was not never fulfilled, and then finally not renewed in Glasgow. And then it became the Loss and Damage Fund, which was put in place without much funding attached to it at all. And to the extent there is any effort of funding, it's through this like market mechanism that don't go with appropriate safeguards. So it becomes a fig leaf, and that's problematic. That's why I think we should go to straight taxation and try to make good use of the money that is being raised that way.
Hello. Hi, Esther. Thank you so much for your session. I had two questions. One is, you mentioned about taxation, but don't you think there is a fundamental flaw in financing through taxation, because in a way it's penalizing the businesses for making money? Rather, don't you think access to capital and access to technology, low cost capital I would say, where for each country, like for example, if about 97 countries in the world are stuck in debt trap, Chinese debt trap, where like high cost opaque funds are given to those countries and they are not able to get out of it. So rather, don't you think low cost capital to these companies, like probably corporations can give something like CSR activities where they can fund the technologies as well as the capital in a low cost manner, like for example how Japan is doing in the ASEAN countries, where they are focusing is on also on the SDGs as well as improving the daily life of the people. So don't you think that would be a much better way rather than I would say just purely doing taxation on the companies? And the second part I wanted to ask is, I would like to know your thoughts about how India is handling the energy transition in like a multi-pronged way, like where the farm is not, like farmers are not just considered as food providers, but also energy providers. So where they are trying to infuse bioethanol into petroleum, so rather than, so where there is much, rather than depending on the fossil fuel, you're trying to create other avenues rather than just electrification.
So I think you misunderstand taxation. Taxation is not penalizing business for making money. Taxation is asking business to contribute for the global public goods that they are using, and repaying the rest of us and the rest of the planet in this way. So in every country of the world, business are taxed. And this taxation of the business allows to provide, workers with a train that give them to the business, and business with roads that they can use to drive their trucks to send their things, and to pay for the army that protects the business, and so on. So the idea of taxing businesses is just absolutely fundamental to the way that we operate as societies. It's not about penalizing, it's about contributing. The part that has not been yet incorporated in the taxation of business is the fact that in the course of their operation and by making in the way that they are making money, they're also depleting our collective asset, which is the health of the planet. So all I'm proposing is to include in the taxation system this component of public good that is being used for by the businesses. I think it is the way you should think about taxation and forget the punishing for making money. This is that's not a very productive framework. Then there is the worry that, okay, fine, but this is going to reduce their incentives to invent and innovate and so on. There is, so that's a legitimate question, and that's why there is a tension between how much we should tax individual or corporations. to continue giving them an incentive to act and to innovate and to be effective. But the evidence suggests that the elasticities of effort or innovation with respect to tax rate is very, very low. What is high is the elasticity of fleeing a country. So when a country has tried to impose a higher tax rate, the company moved to tax havens. That's why it would be nice to have, and there was an effort to have a minimum international tax rate. That was a good first step. And then once you have that, you can just say, well, a part of this taxation is actually going to be used to finance global public goods, in particular a decent environment for the world.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for being here online in real life. Thank you Esther Duflo for being here with us. It was really an honor. We hope that you all have a good night, and Esther Duflo, you have a good afternoon, I guess. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to you.
A lot of work left to do against poverty and to fight climate change, and we better get back to it. Thank you very much. A lot of work left to do against poverty and to fight climate change, and we better get back to it. Thank you very much.